His Excellency, the President of Prince Sultan University, Dr. Ahmed Yamani, Vice Presidents, respected Deans, Vice Deans, Department Chairs, faculty members, students, and distinguished guests. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and a very pleasant morning to you all. On behalf of Prince Sultan University and the College of Architecture and Design, I would like to welcome you all to this discussion seminar about Islamic architecture. My name is Njud Al-Askar. I'm a lecturer in the College of Architecture and Design, and with pleasure, I am here to introduce our prestigious guest, Professor Robert Hillenbrand. Professor Hillenbrand is educated in Cambridge and Oxford and spent most of his career teaching at the University of Edinburgh, with visiting professorship at Princeton, UCLA, Bamberg, Leiden, Dartmouth College, New York, Cairo, and Groningen. He is currently an Emeritus Professor of Islamic Arts at the University of St. Andrews. His scholarly interests focus on Islamic architecture, painting, and iconography, with particular reference to Persian and early Islamic architecture in Syria. He also published more than 200 articles on aspects of Islamic arts and architecture. Additionally, he organized around 10 conferences. He is considered a Slade Professor of Arts at the University of Cambridge and a Fellow at the British Academy and the Royal Society of Edinburgh. This year, Professor Hillenbrand received the King Faisal Prize in the Islamic Studies and Architecture. We are grateful for his presence among us today, and Mrs. Carol Hillenbrand, who also won the King Faisal Prize a few years back. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Robert Hillenbrand.
Thank you.
Professor Robert, may you please welcome on the stage?
Is it on?
We had 300 participants on here. You will present something?
No.
He's not going to give a lecture, so you can start with the questions. If they can come up on the stage.
Questions and answers.
Just bring them up on the stage.
Thank you. I could have done something,
It's okay.
but a hitch in communication.
I understand.
And now I would like to welcome to the stage Professor James Steele, ACSA Distinguished Professor, and as the moderator of the discussion panel, along with my colleagues, Ms. Yara Asiri, lecturer at the Architecture Department, and the students, Huda Al-Qahtani, Senior Architecture student, and Al-Hatun Nafisa, a sophomore student, who will join Professor Hillenbrand in the discussion panel.
Hello.
Is this working? Dr. Hillenbrand is often described as a art historian, but I believe that's not quite appropriate for what he does. He's a cultural detective. He's a poet, he's a dramatist, and a forensic psychologist in terms of the work that he does. He's a towering figure in our field, and Any student of architecture, Islamic architecture, has probably read his book or many books of his. He's a resource, a precious resource, a treasure, and we're really honored to have him here today and lucky to have him here. So we have prepared several questions for him to do more or less a seminar format of question and answer. And I'm sure it will yield a lot of information, valuable information. So I'd like to start with Dr. Yara Asiri. If you can ask a question for Doctor.
Yes. Hi, how are you doing? Hope this is working, yes.
You have to speak up.
Yeah, I need to. Just wanted to congratulate on the King Faisal Prize. Thank you for being with us. So basically, I had the chance to have a very quick look at your very well received book, Islamic Architecture, the Form, Function, and Meaning. And basically, I'm really interested to maybe know about the employment of architectural styles that you used in the book that help to analyze the method or to exemplify the investigation of these building typologies. So basically, there's an architectural analysis that you did for the book and that helped to explain the Islamic buildings. So we would want to know more about this as an architect.
So you're asking Islamic elements in contemporary architecture?
Yeah, there's the Islamic Architecture, Function, and Meaning that was written by Dr. Robert.
How does that apply to contemporary architecture?
Yes.
Can the
You use architectural analysis, basically.
How does what apply?
Islamic architectural principles.
This is a living tradition. It's not a dead tradition. There are Islamic architects working today as they have worked centuries beforehand. The aim is always to build something that can be lived in. As the English philosopher Francis Bacon said, houses are meant to be lived in, not looked at. So that issue of how to build a house, how to build a dwelling in which people can live comfortably, that is at the center of earlier Islamic architecture, and it's at the center of modern Islamic architecture. So the aim has not changed. The means have changed. So I make no claim to be a specialist in modern Islamic architecture. I am not an architect. I was not trained to design buildings. Although I have written a book about the Great Mosque of Abu Dhabi. But my life's work has been to look at earlier buildings, mostly medieval buildings. And I would say that what the Islamic world can teach the Western world, especially in the medieval period, but also again today, is how to create a building you can live in comfortably. Now, a famous example would be the Alhambra. And if you look at the Alhambra, if you see the balance between open spaces and closed spaces, the balance between open views and closed chambers, it is always comfortable. It is as if man is the measure of all things. This is a lesson that medieval Islam could have taught medieval Europe. at a time when Paris was a city of 25,000, Cordoba was a city of 500,000 in the 10th century. It had street lighting, it had running water, it had drains and sewage, it had gardens which were the envy of the Islamic world. So it is that capacity of living with nature and not against nature that is the great strength of Islamic architecture historically, and it can remain the great strength of Islamic architecture today. There's more to say, but let's see what the other questions are.
Can I ask a follow-on to that? In terms of meaning, you mentioned meaning. What do you mean by meaning? I mean, how would you define that?
Buildings speak with different voices. My brother has just visited the Great Mosque of Cordoba, and the person he was with began to cry when she entered the great enclosed space. That is not architecture speaking with a dominating voice. It is inviting you to feel, to use your psyche, to use your emotions. And that is part and parcel of architecture. Architecture is not just a matter of the head, it's a matter of the heart. And architects of quality have always understood this. This does not mean that it is possible always to pin down exactly what is happening. It may be a matter of the interplay of structure and decoration. It may be a matter of proportions. There are proportions that satisfy the mind, even if we cannot identify them mathematically. The idea of the golden section, for example, of the Fibonacci series. These are mysteries to some extent, but we are equipped with our feelings and our emotions to respond to buildings.
You talk about the Shahnameh, the wonderful epic poem, and you talk about how timeless that is, and how the things that were written 1,000 years ago are relevant today. And does meaning change over time?
Well, I think works of art do speak across the centuries. Otherwise, we wouldn't read them. This is perhaps not an audience that is well acquainted with the Persian national epic, their story of their history, which is part myth, part legend, part history. But it is a living story. It has agency today. To this day, people in Iran call their children by the names of the kings in the Book of Kings. I can't think of any European country where the language of a poem written 1,000 years ago is still understood, is still learnt by heart and recited by people who are illiterate. That isn't architecture, it's literature, but the same principle applies, that these great masterpieces, whether they're masterpieces of architecture like the Dome of the Rock, like the Taj Mahal, like the Alhambra, they speak with many voices, and they lead you into areas of the mind and the spirit that surprise you. God bless them.
So they're timeless values that retain. Ms. Hoda Al-Katani.
So hello, Dr. Helen Brand. So Dr. Helen Brand, our Saudi 2030 vision focuses on improving the quality of life and the built environment, both now and in the future, following ecological imperatives. So in your opinion, how do you think this goal falls into alignment with the Islamic principles?
So the Vision 2030 has elements in it that relate to human value and quality of life. And how do you align those with Islamic value?
I think those are the same qualities that we value in the West, but we may not find the right way of expressing them. I would say that there is this requirement in the modern Islamic world to bring the environment into a building as much as possible. That when you look around, not just in your own country, but throughout, for instance, most of the Arab lands, what are we seeing now? We are seeing galloping modernization, galloping industrialization. We are seeing the rapid destruction of cultural heritage. To take an example from your own country, in the last 100 years, Jeddah has lost 92% of its traditional housing. The bit that remains, everybody now recognizes that it was valuable. But the grandparents of this audience did not realize that, did not value it. So the modern Islamic world, and I'm not just talking about Saudi Arabia, I'm talking about the entire modern Islamic world, is playing catch up. It is behind the times. It has lost so much of its cultural heritage that your grandchildren will find it difficult to forgive you for not preserving enough. So the challenge is to value, to treasure national heritage, while also building for the future. And building for the future, the questions that I was sent from you emphasized, how do we build in a green way? How do we build in a sustainable way? Now, in a way, you're asking the wrong person, because my expertise is in the past. It's not in the present, it's not in the future. But the past has lessons to teach us. Let me look at only one thing for the moment: materials. There are many Islamic countries, especially in the Eastern Islamic world, who continue to use traditional materials. Now, I would not be so bold as to say, stop using modern materials. That's not possible. But it is possible to build more in the traditional way. And if I limit myself for the moment to materials, that means using brick or stone and not concrete. It is a fact that you can verify with your own eyes that brick and stone grow old gracefully. They look better and better as they get older and older. Brick, for example, acquires a kind of sheen, a kind of light or patina that is very pleasing to the eye. And it's not just a matter of looks. If you build thick walls, you are cool in the summer and warm in the winter. If you use wind catchers by diagonally placed planks in the upper part of the building, you catch breezes that then help to create fresh air in the rest of the building. Brick, stone, and wood are materials that improve with age. So in the matter of materials alone, it would be worth spending more time and more money building with those materials in some cases. I know you can't do it all the time, but it's a mistake to have a city that is entirely made of concrete. It will look worse and worse as it gets older and older. That is the lesson of the past. In Harvard, they have a center for Islamic heritage in the built environment. And they give prizes for buildings that are in the spirit of Islam. And most of those prizes over the last 30 years have gone to buildings in brick or stone or wood, not buildings in concrete. So this is just to think about. I wouldn't be so bold as to say, do it.
Hatun.
Dr. Hallenberg, in 2015, the United Nations developed a list of 17 sustainability goals. Each one of them is critically important to us as future architects in the kingdom. But Goal 11 is especially so. It asks that we make cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. How can we integrate Islamic principles into this goal?
Sustainability, in the United Nations put forward goals for sustainability in 2017, I believe, and they have 17 principles. And the one you're talking about has to do with human settlements and making them more humane and making them more resilient and making them more comfortable for living. So how do you, again, square that with, how do you inculcate Islamic principles into that idea? It's a Western idea. How do you manage it? It's more or less the same answer, I mean, yeah, as you had before.
I have quite a radical solution to that, and it may not please everybody listening to me. It is that you study the past. I have spent all my adult life looking at Islamic architecture of the past, not Islamic architecture of the present. And to look at that architecture and to study that architecture teaches you what is meant by Islamic principles in architecture. This is not something that some clever professor thinks about in his study, and then he writes you 10 commandments of what you should do. This is a matter of learning from the experience of the past. I wonder if I asked all students in this room to put up their hands if they have been in their own person to look at Islamic architecture of the past outside this country. How many people can put up their hands that they have looked at Islamic architecture of the past outside Saudi Arabia? One. Two. Come on, let me see a forest of hands. I'm delighted to see some hands.
Yeah, I suppose. Sorry, King. I suppose the architecture course, Islamic course, actually covers beyond the Middle East and goes far. Yeah, I'm sure some of my students or our students, they actually know.
Right. I'm delighted because the study of Islamic architecture in the Islamic world is far behind the study of Islamic architecture in the Islamic world. That is disgraceful. That is a tragedy. It is all wrong. It is your culture, your language, your religion that is behind the Islamic architecture of the past. It is in your blood, in your flesh and bones that you know. So you shouldn't be reading books by people like me who come from another culture, who love your culture, respect your culture, admire your culture, but are nevertheless strangers. And this problem that runs right across the Islamic world, from Morocco to Indonesia, that when people are interested in Islamic architecture of the past, do you know what they focus on? They focus on the Islamic architecture of their country alone. This is the triumph of nationalism against the triumph of globalism. And it is very sad to see. So I'm thinking of actual people I know and have worked with. I remember a first-class Iraqi scholar who had visited every Islamic building of the past in Iraq, and he knew them intimately. He had studied them all his life, but he had never been to Syria. He had never been to Iran, and he had never been to Turkey. And these are the neighbors of Iraq. What's going on? The modern political boundaries are not the boundaries of the past. And so, if your study is limited to your own country, you will never have the perspective that comes from looking at a much wider body of material from all over the Islamic world. So, in the next generation, I want to see, or rather I won't see it because I will be dead, but I would like to think that there will be books by Muslims about Islamic architecture as a whole, not by Moroccan specialists on the architecture of Morocco, who don't look at the work of Algerian specialists on the architecture of Algeria, but people who have traveled widely, who have looked at a wide range of Islamic buildings, and who can then be in a position, and this takes us back to the idea of Islamic principles, they will then be in a position to say something about what the Islamic principles are on the basis of evidence, the evidence of actual buildings, not some philosopher, some theory generated in the West, but information grounded in fieldwork, in looking closely at this incredibly rich treasury of buildings of the past.
Thank you. And one final question from myself. Your book, Islamic Architecture in North Africa, you talk about how two positions in the faith changed the form of the city of Cairo. And I'm thinking of the Fatimid and the Ayyubid, the way that the city transformed under those two regimes, from a rectilinear gridiron plan to a very organic plan. And so the question is, social forces today behind the evolution of typologies and institutions, are they still at work? And if so, how would that change Riyadh, for example? In your opinion, would the city form change according to the change of what's happening in the culture?
You expose my ignorance. This is not something I can really answer from my own experience. I would say, I mean, one of the questions that I was sent was about North Africa. What is your opinion about the most artistic preoccupations that shaped the architecture of that region? Well, I did think about that, but that's not really your question.
Well, I'm just wondering if the social reforms that are happening now in the culture are going to have a knock-on effect on the physical form of the city. In general, how would that play out in the future?
Well, I think there have been extraordinarily successful attempts in the past to build a city from scratch. There wasn't an example in the Umayyad period, but look at Al-Mansur. In 762, he builds the round city of Baghdad, and he builds it as a round city. It's an extraordinarily selfish city because it has a huge empty heart with just his palace and the great mosque, and the people are on the outside in the segments. So perhaps it's not surprising that within 2 generations people had deserted the round city. That was not a good machine for living. But Cairo is another situation altogether. That was a much more successful attempt on the part of the Fatimids to build a new quarter. And if we go further into the history of the Islamic world, the way that the city of Isfahan in the 17th century was recreated on a gigantic scale, or Delhi, or Agra, or Fatehpur Sikri. There have been very bold attempts to build new cities with a proper respect for circulation, a proper respect for breathing space. These have been examples of success. let me point you to an example of failure. Samarra. Samarra on the Tigris extends for 50 miles in the 9th century, and it's wasteful, ribbon development, with everybody thinking for themselves alone, no overall plan. So if we transport that experience into today, what is needed is an overarching plan, not for competing businesses to grab a piece of land and exploit it. And that calls for government control, but beyond control, it calls for vision. And vision is not always easy to find.
Well, I'd like to close with a quote, again from Shahnameh. Ferdowsi says, "I shall not die. These seeds I've sown will save my reputation from the grave." And I dare say the same about you in terms of the legacy you leave in all of the students you've taught and the influence you've had on the field. You're a giant, and we're really happy to have you here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your help. Pleasure. That was really something. Thank you.
We have a gift for you from our chairman, the chairman of the board of the
Oh,
university.
thank you very much. Riyadh, a paradigm. This will teach me a lesson. Thank you.
Thank you all for this interesting and valuable discussion. And now I'll move to the audience if there are any questions.
There are further questions. That's fine. I don't mind.
They're coming from the audience.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much for an important lesson to all of us, especially in the Islamic world. I would, just my question, no doubt our history is very deep and we can learn a lot from it. But I would say, when I look into architecture, it seems to me it's more dominated by culture rather than religion. When you look to the examples all over the Islamic world. And I am supposed to learn from the past to advance into the future. It cannot be static. So what do we learn from the past to build on it to move on into the future and to be more creative, just like everything else? So we should learn from the past to move on to, of course, circumstances back then is totally different than today's circumstances. So what do we build on that past to move on into the future? And thank you.
I think the very first thing you have to do is to guard your cultural heritage, so that the buildings of the past are there as silent policemen to tell you how not to behave. Now, if you look around the Islamic world today, I see two major dangers that stop you learning from the past. The first is tourism. And tourism brings to poor countries a great deal of money. And because so much money comes in, let me take the case of Central Asia and the 5 stans. All of them poor, all of them with important medieval Islamic buildings in them. Their governments look on these buildings not as cultural heritage to be respected and preserved. No, they look at them as a source of income. And so the coachloads of tourists come, and with the tourists comes destruction. And not just destruction because of the number of people that walk around a building, but also destruction that comes from restoration. Because there will be the foolish ones, the greedy ones, who will look at a 14th century building and say, this needs to be tidied up. This looks dirty. This looks ruined. I know, let's pull it down and build it anew. And you know, that's exactly what they do. That is exactly what they do. They destroy an 11th century building and they put up a 21st century building, and no one tells the tourists, so they come and they take their pictures of it and they think they've seen something. So the very first thing that you need to do to safeguard your cultural heritage is to teach experts how to restore buildings. And they have to have a feel, a sixth sense for what works and what doesn't work. You have to spend so long with a brick building that you breathe brick. You understand it. In that same area of Central Asia, they don't like the look of old brick, and so they have sand blasting machines. And these are like, well, I can't think of a parallel, but they're like sandpaper, and you put it onto the surface of the building, and it works at high speed. It works at high speed, and in no time at all, the building looks modern. It has lost its soul. It's lost what makes it attractive. So you need to train restorers, and you need to control tourism. Those are 2 of the most important ways in which you can learn from the past. Keep your buildings in good order, protect them, look after them, understand them. And as you build up an army of technicians who understand these buildings, they can be kept in good repair for your children's children, instead of being swept away in some modernization program.
Can I have just a follow-up question, please? Now, let's just assume the generation in the medieval age, if they are here today with all the available tools, do you think they will come up with the same building that they were built back then?
Well,
that's the culture.
I think once again it's a question of learning from the past. And I'm not sure how many departments of architectural history there are in your universities in this country. The only way that you'll learn about it is by studying it. And that will teach you some of what, we go back to your question, some of what the Islamic principles are. They are very often a matter of good manners. What works? not a matter of building structures that are essentially Western international structures with a bit of Islamic flim-flam on the surface. That is pastiche. That's not the real thing.
Okay, just a last thing. I won't ask any more. But now when you started your discussion, you just said architecture, something is to live in, not to look at. Is that a true statement?
Architecture to live in, not to look at. Is that a true statement?
Well, of course it's a true statement. You've got to be able to live in a building, and you've got to be able to live in it comfortably. And that means keeping an eye on proper proportion. I said earlier, man is the measure of all things. If you look at what Hitler planned for Germany in the 1930s and 40s, he wanted to make Berlin the world capital of architecture. And what he produced was a series of buildings that were impossible to be lived in. They were just too big. They were an expression of his personality. So think small rather than big, I would say. But I keep saying, I am not a designer, I am not an architect. You are asking the wrong person.
Thank you very much.
I don't think I shall please him.
Thank you all for this informative discussion. And now I would like to welcome His Excellency, the President of Prince Sultan University, Dr. Ahmed Yamani, on the stage to honor our guest speaker.
Thank you very much for your help.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Sorry about the break. Thanks.
لا خلي بنات.
We have something.
Oh, thank you.
This represents the Saudi architect heritage.
Wow. What a wonderful thing.
This is the burning incense.
That's wonderful. An incense burner.
Incense, exactly.
I've never seen anything like it.
And this is the incense that you can
The incense itself.
It's incense itself.
For good architecture is also a matter of smell and of sound. The sound of running water, the smell of aromatic shrubs and flowers. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed.
You see, this is now what you open it up.
That's wonderful. You need to be strong.
Yeah. Man.
You may need a machine.
This is the instant burner.
Ah, yes.
Yeah, these are smells very good. You got the charcoal, you put it here.
Yes.
But it does open. Man.
Never mind.
Yeah.
We'll do that at home. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank
very
you.
much. Very pleasant.
Thank you.
Now, I would like to welcome the Dean of College of Architecture and Design, Vice Dean and Chairpersons on the stage for a group photo.
Group photo with you.
Right.
Group picture.
May I take this off?
Yeah, of course.
Yes.
فيك دكتورة. Thank you all for joining us today and hope to see you next time.